This is National Human Trafficking Prevention Month. So every January, and there's a certain day too, but let me just read the first paragraph of that proclamation. Across the world, more than 27 million people, including thousands here at home, and this is from President Biden, are subjected to the shameful, abhorrent abuse of human trafficking and forced labor. Human trafficking targets the most vulnerable in our society and exploits them, denying their human rights, freedom, and dignity. It is a stain on our collective conscience and an affront to basic human dignity. During National Human Trafficking Prevention Month, we recommit to working to end human trafficking in America and around the globe. And let us say a prayer. So loving God, source of all grace and protection, we pray for an end to human trafficking. We know it's a complex issue with many, many facets, but we know that your will is justice and peace and well-being for all people. And so again, we ask for your presence today with this group and with us all as we learn more about this issue and what we can do to make a difference. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Yeah, thanks for having me. I haven't given a presentation like this before, so I'm thankful to do it in such a nice setting with some intelligent people that will ask some good questions, so I can do it better next time. So if I don't if you're confused about anything that's going on, then we'll just ask some dumb questions, you know. So I've been working with men and people that are involved with sexual exploitation. So talking about human trafficking, we tend to talk about labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So I will make mention of sex, sexual assault and sexual abuse, but I'll try not to be explicit about it. But feel free to ask more questions. You know, I'm sure we can all handle it. So I'm going to try to just give some broad definitions and an outline of what it is that we're talking about. So hopefully you can keep up and sort of understand what it is that we're dealing with. But as a progressive church, I'm told you might have heard this term, sex work is work. For me, that's a struggle to wrap my mind around, but I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit. So what do we mean by sex work is work? We mean that anyone whose profession is providing them with gainful employment, with a means to support themselves, deserves respect and dignity and should not be discriminated against, such in the case of making their profession illegal, in the case of sex work. We also mean that sex work should be destigmatized. After all, millions of blue-collar workers, such as myself, sell their bodies every day, in a way, every day for a paycheck. And so why should anyone be denied the ability to freely use their body in a agreement between individuals for exchange of money, right? My body belongs to me, so what does anyone have to say about how I use it, right? So I think that's maybe the more liberal, very progressive view of what it means to respect sex workers' rights. And we'll get back to that in a little bit. And I'm sure you can all sympathize with those arguments for the case. But let's define sex work to begin with. That is an exchange for money, products, or services for sexual services, and that can be a really broad definition. So that can include stripping, phone sex, pornography, escorting, and we'll be talking more about prostitution today. So it can be a really broad scope of different activities, and I want to differentiate sex work from trafficking. As you learn more about it, there's a lot of crosstalk about the differences. So when we talk about trafficking specifically, this is when someone else benefits using force, fraud, or coercion. And there are many different parties that are involved in this arrangement. So you have buyers, which have been called Johns in the past. Those are the people that are purchasing sex, more likely men than women. Almost 100% of purchases are done by men. We talk about prostituted women or victims. There's all sorts of colorful language that you can probably think about, different words to use for that. So when we talk about sex workers or prostitutes, this is maybe just a broader term, and the way that the movement that I'm involved with, we talk about victims. And then there are traffickers, otherwise known as pimps. They might have other names. They could be called boyfriends or handlers or something like that. And depending on where you find your statistics and what it actually is that you're defining, people have said that anywhere from 70 to 80 to even 90% of people are doing this sex work willingly, freely, and are making money off of it. So my main questions that I face myself, especially when we're talking about the differences between sex work and sex trafficking, are I have two questions that I struggle to answer myself and form my frame of reference for this question. And the first one is sex buying inherently harmful? And my answer is yes, that it's both inherently harmful to the person purchasing sex and to the person that is selling sex, both on an individual level, in a relationship level, and on a society-wide level. We can get into more reasons why I find that to be true. And there are still lots of debates between different groups of, say, feminist thinkers that, like, you might have heard of Catherine McKinnon, who thinks that all types of sex work and payment for sex is inherently violent. And I tend to agree with that for the most part. There are other people like Martha Nussbaum, who says that this is just like any other type of wear and tear on your body. If you're selling your physical abilities, then what are we to judge, right? I disagree with that, and maybe most of you do as well. The other question that I try to answer for myself is, can and does a sex worker enter into this agreement willingly? And my answer is no, at least for the vast, vast majority. I think that the purchases of someone's body is intrinsically exploitative and damaging to women. And these beliefs classify me as a feminist abolitionist. I think that sex buying is inherently hierarchical, patriarchal, and there is a power imbalance anytime that money is involved. Do I do my job willingly when I go to work in the morning? Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. I think there is some type of power differential that happens there. And workers with fewer and fewer alternatives or resources are forced by their circumstances into giving up their free will and dignity. It's a fact of the matter that the majority of this problem lies on the backs of those that are most marginalized in our communities. So who does the sex work? It's women. It's young women, and it's young women of color that are living in poverty, with housing instability, that are in and out of the foster care system, people that are LGBTQIA+, people with a history of trauma, people living with untreated mental health issues, addictions issues, developmental disabilities. These are the risk factors that might lead you into a life of of sex trafficking. And the further and further you go down this checklist of risk factors, you know, the shorter the end of your stick becomes, right? These are victims of circumstances. We know, for example, that like indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to be the victims of sexual violence, right? So the more oppressed that you are, the more likely you are to be exploited. And trans kids are way more likely to be in the life. In my mind, there's no way of justifying that people are doing this willingly. It's mostly about survival and economics. This isn't a moral issue for me, this is a social issue. And people in the movement consider this to be a form of modern day slavery, and I do as well. People are forced into this through violence. And this is something that's happening all around us. A lot of people have been really naive to the circumstances. It's only been in the past 5, maybe 10 years that even the police have come to understand this as a response to victims. We're not penalizing the women for being a part of this. We need to attack the demand side of the equation. And we could talk a lot more about the police work. So just in Portland, this is a $60 million a year industry. This came from the police themselves as part of a presentation. 11,000 purchase attempts happen every week. That's more than 1,500 every day. And I would guess that those statistics are even pretty low. There was a sex workers' rights bill in 2021 that was introduced to Portland legislation through a technicality. People weren't allowed, didn't actually make it onto any ballots. But this was just a very slightly veiled attempt by big business owners and brothel owners to introduce language onto a ballot that sounded very progressive and very liberating, but was just another way to subjugate women. So there's different roads to legality. We can talk about decriminalization or legalization. So legalization might be where there are constraints around what you can do as a sex worker. This might be a brothel model where within certain confines, with certain permits and conditions, whether that's taking STD tests, getting a license, that sort of thing. That would be one way for legalization of sex work to happen in Portland or Vancouver or anywhere. And that's what happens in Nevada, in some of these in communities where it is legal. That's the only place that it's legal in the United States right now. But it might not be far off where this actually comes to our city and state. It was actually the first bill introduced, I think, in the rest of the U.S. to actually propose something like this. And actually, for some reason, Tina Kotek in Portland vetoed a bill to actually do research about the advantages and disadvantages of allowing sex work to happen in Portland. So I'm afraid that we might get more initiatives like this with public support behind them coming up on ballots, disguised in thinly veiled language about the rights of sex workers and that sort of thing. But to move on to, well, I guess I should say, how do people enter the life? The fact of the matter is that it's not this abduction story of, middle-class white girls being grabbed, snatched off the corner of the bus stop on their way to school. You're usually trafficked by someone that you're very familiar with. You're more likely to be trafficked by a family member than anyone else. or it might be an intimate partner, a boyfriend, someone like that. The average age of entering the life in Portland is 13 to 15. The national average is 15. And actually, let's see, in Portland, the mortality rate, at least in one organization, they found that the mortality rate for this job is 2%. And when you're talking about the deadliest profession in the US, which is also logging, which is a big industry in Oregon and Washington, we're talking about 85 out of 100,000 deaths. Yeah, 85 deaths per 100,000. I don't think that's yearly. I think that's like in your lifetime. So this is an awful profession, and I can understand the argument for decriminalizing the trade in order to make it safer, so we can protect people, so they have legal rights. They can go to the police when they have crimes committed against them. The chances of you being raped is about 50%, and the likelihood of you being the victim of violence is between 90, 95, and 100%. Obviously, this is a dangerous profession. It is underground. It is stigmatized. So we're dealing with a whole slew of issues here. But the fact of the matter is that it happens in every single community. The police that I've talked to, they say, you know, if you think that this doesn't happen in your town, like, you're mistaken. Do you have money in your town? Do you have roads? Do you have internet? Do you have men? Okay, you have those 4 things, then you have sex trafficking in your community. This is happening under our noses. It's a shadow industry, and it's no less than modern day slavery, if you ask me. And the way that this coercion works is very sophisticated. Traffickers use, you know, the same way that domestic violence survivors are trauma bonded to their oppressors. The same way that people don't speak out about sexual violence that happens to them, the same mechanisms are being used in these trafficking situations. Why don't people just leave the life? Well, they might literally have been taken away from their families, encouraged not to talk to their friends and family. They might not have a cell phone anymore. Their pimper trafficker might be in control of their bank account. They might have access to their children. They might have your Rolodex of friends and family. So the amount of shame and isolation that comes from this is really difficult. And this isn't a gainful employment either. So pimps and traffickers keep nearly 100% of the returns, and most women are, let's say, represented by a pimp. So really.
Speak up, please.
Yes. I guess I'll get to my story as well, and what I do with the EPIC project. But it was through my wife, Rachel, who's worked with the Set Free movement, which is a church-based organization that deals with human and sexual exploitation around the world. We went to a forum at a church that was an open discussion with different leaders in the community about what it was, and that's where I met Justin, who is one of the founders of the EPIC project. And their goal is to end human trafficking by disrupting demand. And this is a supply and demand issue. If there's no demand from men, then it will be no supply. It will literally dissolve overnight, right? And so they've actually expanded their mission not to just disrupt the purchasing of sex, but to disrupt the culture of what it means to be a man in modern society, and how we talk about masculinity, how we talk to our young people, how we raise boys to become men. So that's why it's important to have a really broad approach to stopping exploitation before it even starts. But what Epic's primary work is essentially to run a national call center that posts ads online posing as women who are selling their services, and we give them our phone numbers. So this is through text messaging, through phone calls. We are literally disrupting men at the point of sale. So when they call and they're asking for Betty Lou, we say, sorry to disappoint you, but my name's Nick, and I'm working with a bunch of guys to talk to men like you in this special moment. And the conversations, you can imagine, are kind of colorful. Yes, most of them just hang up or say, get off my back, I'm just going to call the next number. But the calls that do go well go really well, and we can talk about that more. Some of the other work that I've done, opportunities with Epic Project, is they've created a good working relationship with the local police department, Multnomah and Clackamas County primarily, and Clark County as well, to come with them for different missions. There was actually a sting earlier this week where they were having men meet them at hotels. They had decoys, women, undercover police officers that were asking men to meet them, and then they'd be apprehended on the scene. So I've been able to, as a citizen, come along to these missions, these sting operations, and after the men are free to go, after they've been cited and released, the officers say, would you like to talk to these guys that are here? They're talking to men like you. And it's surprising that men will sit down with us and have a conversation about their experience. And I've had a few other speaking engagements. I also do work with the sex buyer accountability and diversion classes, which has been going on for maybe 10 years in Portland. And so that's when men get cited for these violations, instead of going to jail or getting a fee, they go through a class. And this is led by survivors and people that with lived experience, informing them about the realities of sex trafficking. So instead of just being punished, we've found that education, reflection, and relationships are the way to actually reform sex buyers, instead of just trying to scare people. We can't arrest our way out of this. Something like 1 in 10,000 traffickers are being arrested, right? Obviously that would be a big help if we could get at these guys, but it happens everywhere, and there's just not enough police officers to do to get around this. But also, the Portland police have really become sophisticated about their approach. So although prostitution is illegal, they're not arresting sex workers anymore. They are providing them services and connecting them to service providers. There's a great place called Safety Compass in Portland that is run by survivors and is a safe place for people in the life and people trying to exit the life. So they provide shelter, food, clothing, childcare services, that sort of thing. And so they're there with the police talking to women. On average, it takes 2 years and 10 escape attempts.
So the sex with the women, this is also considered an addiction for some, like
Yeah.
drugs and alcohol, it's an addiction. So I'm sure you've encountered men in that category.
Yeah.
That need much more than just a 2-week course.
Yeah, that's true. That is one pathway, a common one. I don't know exactly what percentage of sex buyers are sex addicts. We do provide those services in our classes. There's Sexaholics Anonymous, which is run like Alcoholics Anonymous. And I've been providing names of a counselor that I work with who does men's groups and sexual counseling. But I'd say maybe 10% of the men that I have met consider themselves to be addicted. A lot of people are addicted to pornography. That's also a big topic that we talk about. And as your addiction grows, the fix that you need becomes greater, right? So the pornography stops being effective for a lot of people. So then they start seeking out, these experiences. But it's very much a part of that. You're right. Are you raising your hand?
Well, with my husband, he died 10 years ago now, and it was just like, why are you looking at anything that's pornography? Aren't I enough?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're just going, some of that.
Well,
yeah,
I don't know how to say this, but as a man, I don't ask that question. Like, why? I could see the appeal, and there's maybe some research about that.
But I mean, this is what I was feeling inside.
I think.
And my daughter at that time went to meet her husband, a future husband, and she said, "Do I look like a hooker?" And I told her, "You're dressed like a hooker, are you?"
Okay, that's interesting.
Be dressed like you, are you a hooker? And my husband was saying, "Well, you shouldn't be dressing so that men will want to attack you, because as a woman shouldn't dress that way."
This is a classic example of maybe victim blaming, or this is the responsibility of men, if you ask me, to be well behaved and to keep themselves in check. This is also the responsibility of older men to be teaching and mentoring young men how to be in the world, right? And the way that I frame the way that I frame pornography is like, this is a completely new problem that we have not ever experienced in the history of humankind, right? And even not in the past 20, 30 years, it's even transformed, right? Like, in about 5 seconds, I can be seeing some explicit images, like right now in church, right? Before, I'm sure some of you would find magazines under mattresses or, in the rafters in the garage or something. That's how a lot of men are exposed to this thing. And especially as a young man, you're exploring these things. A lot of us have not been taught explicitly by our parents, by our fathers, by the men around us about this, because there is so much shame involved around it. And especially for Christian men, there's a lot of shame dealing with these feelings as you're growing up about that draw that brings you to desire that, right? And it can become an addiction, it can become a problem, it can become something that you don't know how to deal with. So there's not a real answer to your problem. I think we're sort of perpetually stuck with this, and we need to be more open. My answer is to be more open about the problems that we face and talking about it as men, as adult men especially, because I'm sure we've all struggled with something akin to that. And there's no reason why we should be too shameful. And the way that we do that is by manning up, let's say, and saying, I struggle too, or yeah, it's hard. You're going to fail. You might have these desires, but let's let's have an open discussion about it. Like, we're all humans, we all have sexual desires, right? We can't hide it. And I think that's why this issue has been pushed underground, is because people don't want to talk about it. They don't want to know that it exists. And you'd be surprised at who the men are that are purchasing sex. I've talked about it in my blog article and on the podcast. But the room of men that I talk to in these classes are literally the most diverse group of people that you could gather in the city of Portland, you know. Young and old, you know, these are underage men, these are poor people, these are rich people, they come from all walks of life, professionals in suits, and, you know, maybe the stereotypes that you might think, people that are into violence and sex and drugs and crime, but it takes all kinds. Like, people, if you know, it's like one in 10 men will purchase sex in their lifetime. Like, that's a pretty high number. If you know 10 men, you might know a sex buyer. I'm not saying that to scare you or have you question the people around you, because I'm sure you know a lot of good people. It's just more common than you think, and that's why.
Why there's so many numbers.
That's why there's so many numbers.
There's only a way when you reporting the number. I mean, my gracious. But when you're talking about that's how the numbers are so broad.
They're big numbers, yeah. And I think increasingly, at least in my mind and in my investigations and my thoughts, I think this is really related to the epidemic that we have of loneliness, especially for young men. I'm sorry, I'm feeling extra emotional this morning. I think Martha kind of set me off because we're remembering my dad's death.
Do you need a Kleenex?
No, it's all right.
It's okay to cry, Nick, that's okay.
I know, I just want to be able to speak as well.
I know, that's hard too.
But yeah, there's a correlation between, I believe, between loneliness, isolation, and the issues that men are facing today. There's something happening in our culture where men are being left behind. And there's a lot of statistics to support that, and we need to have a discussion about it. So as much of like a feminist that I want to be in my life, I've realized, you know, that it's like we gotta like come up with solutions to the base problems that we're being faced. So that's like economic instability for women that are forcing them into this life. You know, giving their traffickers the toehold that they need to be like, well, if you need $100, I can get you $100 tonight. You need to pay your rent, well, you can pay your rent pretty easily. It just requires a warm body, right? But we're also talking about young people that might be issued into the life because their social support networks are failing. Homeless runaways, young people, people in the foster care system, people that don't have adults taking care of them are more likely to be entering the life. But we're also talking about, buyers, future young men that are going to be drawn into this life. A lot of it is people that are feeling very alone, and I'm surprised at the amount of men that just say I was lonely and I needed someone to talk to, or my friends were busy. I moved to a new city. I didn't know how to fit in, so I can't get a date. I just needed someone, and it's easy to go online and figure out how to do these things. So it's a broad topic, and especially talking about modern masculinity. Rachel has a son, my stepson, who's 20 years old now, and it's really horrifying. Really horrifying. I'm sure it was horrifying for my parents raising a teenage son. and a 17-year-old daughter too. Like we're worried about our young women, right? Because we're worried about our young men. And what do we do as a community to shore up our young people? There's something new for every generation to deal with. You have another comment?
And we're pretty aware women have only been able to, we're not property anymore, but that is still the thinking of so many.
Yeah.
We're realizing more and more
Yeah.
that we're moving away from.
The male gaze, male entitlement to females' bodies. I mean, it's
Well, they control everything.
it's in the culture. It's
Yeah.
on TV.
In a way.
Well, it's getting worse too, right?
It's getting worse, and it's shielded in this language of female empowerment or not being prudish about enjoying sex and that sort of thing. But the messages that come with that are that we're men are fed eye candy all the time, and if you don't, it's up to us to deal with our triggers as men, I think, but also, we need to say that like we're just not okay with this, like, and I struggle with that too, being a very liberal, progressive guy, trying to support, modern life. I've really sort of come full circle from like these, what you might consider more conservative values and sex positivity to being like, wait, no, like this is affecting our minds and our hearts like deeper than we know. So
Can I jump in here? I'm just I'm making some connections.
Please.
You're talking about that we don't talk about sex, right? We
Yeah.
don't talk about grief either. We don't talk about spirit. And so
Yeah.
I think we've really truncated ourselves, that we're kind of heads, and we're not
Yeah.
bodies, and we're not spirits.
human needs, yeah, I think the whole package of human needs, that's true. Bodies with physical needs, whether that's
and
sexual,
emotions,
yeah, and especially as men, we don't talk about our emotional needs, our needs for connection.
You don't even know your emotions, or most men.
No, exactly, yeah, and
Identify
there's this gap. I think young men today. That's why I'm really encouraged about our son too. Is he has the language to talk about his feelings and his emotions and not fall into these masculinity traps, right? But at the same time, young men don't have the sociality that they used to. And so I think that leads to, these feelings of depression and loneliness.
Anxieties on the right.
Anxiety
All these things are on
and
the right.
lack of connection
Yeah.
with friends and wider community.
The things that churches used to provide.
I really agree with that, Martha, in so many ways.
Religious communities.
Do you have ideas of how to reach these young men versus, I mean, they used to come to church, right? And I feel like
All of
they said that people are starting to come back to church, which is a good thing.
It's really interesting,
But then
yeah.
it's kind of a thing talking about at church.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of
Yeah.
conservative churches would probably freak out or whatever, but
Yeah.
it needs to be, they need to be taught, and if they're parents,
Yeah.
I guess it'd be a parent class to teach their kids,
Yeah.
I guess, or.
It's such a huge
There's
cultural thing that we need to talk about.
I just recently, I've had surgery, so I've been kind of binging different TV shows, old ones like
Interesting.
Everwood, which is a great one if you ever get to see it. It talks about all the teen things and how, the teens are waiting to have sex.
Yeah,
Which I
yeah.
think is so great in this.
It's really
movie, or
interesting.
It's a series, it's a four years or four season.
Yeah.
But they talk about all the hard things that kids
Yeah.
go through, and these kids will go through.
Yeah.
And how they come out of it.
Yeah, we're getting really mixed messages, I think, from the culture. I think part of it is we're taught a lot about sexual violence, and we're taught a lot about toxic masculinity, but we're not taught a lot about like the beauties of sex and relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
So especially where I've grown up, I've gotten a lot of messages about how men are crap, right? And so, of course, that can lead to great things, but let's talk about how men are let's talk about how men are awesome and about how women are awesome and how we can do sex better, or, you know, talking about premarital sex. Like, do we even know where we fall on that? Like, maybe you're right. Maybe we do need to get parents involved. But so I think that's a really individual question, and I think all communities need to be talking about it amongst themselves. But one of my big answers is adult mentorship. And especially men with young men. So that's one of the things that I'm encouraging, and I think that the EPIC project is encouraging.
Well, tell them about maybe this is when you tell them about what you're starting, your nonprofit.
Yeah, I'll go briefly into that. It's called Skillcraft Institute. I started a nonprofit this year, and we're just about to start programming. But I'm a fabricator. I build stuff for a living, and so I want to kind of marry these like traditional masculine skills like woodworking, power tools, and really hands-on learning and experiencing. And there's a lot of old men, retired men that get into woodworking, right? And they don't have a lot of things to do, and their wives might want them to get out of the house a little bit. So why not combine them, you know, with young people that are coming up that might not have those parental figures? Men really bond shoulder to shoulder working on projects. And so when you can get people together to be in the same space doing these things and have repeated connections over time, like in a church, those conversations can come up. So I'm starting a studio and workspace where where I get the most vulnerable people in our populations to get job skills and training and job placements and that sort of thing, but also have these classes and interactions with mentors. And of course, I want to do it a lot with young women too, and adult women.
So if they wanted more information about that, I don't see it listed on your.
Oh, that's true. I forgot to do it.
Email on there, I guess.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what's the name of
But
it?
Skillcraft Institute.
And if you.
Our website should be up in the next couple
Oh,
weeks.
okay.
I can let you all know. But we've been ignoring your comments over here.
First of all, thank you for sharing what you're sharing. I think not just society, the church certainly needs it. Somebody mentioned men in church. I mean, I've been a pastor for a long time. Trying to get men to talk about their feelings is a monumental.
Yeah.
But the one place I've found it to be successful, I've done a lot of promotion of spiritual renewal events, like Via Cristo, and I found that when you get a bunch of guys going through that, if you can use that to get them together, they're more willing to express their feelings.
Yeah.
Some of the circles I've been in after those events, I've been surprised at how open they will be once you can get it going, right?
Yeah.
But it's not easy.
It takes the situation and good leadership to really get that to happen. I've been working hard the past couple of years in these one-day classes that we do for the sex buyer diversion classes, to be able to get people to start talking about why they purchase sex, what in their lives led them to that point, and what they're going to do now that, you know, it's all on the table. And so it's gone from like a classroom presentation with like a slideshow to like breakout discussion groups where we talk about these things in little baby steps, right? Because I've found that it's relationships and it's the culture that gets people to be open and to change. And the biggest encouragement that I have for people is to not be afraid to talk to their loved ones, or especially their male friends, about this type of thing. You know, it's huge and it's devastating. You know, people have a lot of shame around it, but when people do open up, everyone's always surprised at like how good it feels and how receptive people are, you know? Like if any of us men hesitate to open up about our feelings, that means that the other guy is also like, I would like to talk about this, or I'd be okay with it. So it's like we just need to be a little bit more vulnerable with each other.
We've talked about some of the reasons people would buy sex. Say
Mhm.
for immediate gratification,
Yeah.
or loneliness, or or wanting to prove their masculinity.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering how much of is driven, how are they viewing the women they're purchasing from? Are they objectifying? Are they thinking about
Yeah.
who these people are or what their lives are like? I mean, they're not really going on a date.
No,
where they're
that's-
gonna get to know someone.
that's-
Who do they think they're dealing with? I mean,
Yeah, that's one of the, another deep problem about this interaction is it's so private and so easy. And women are trained to make it easy on men, even if they're in an exploitative situation and they want to get out and they're screaming inside, they put on a show, right? They say, "Oh, I'm so happy to see you, like this is going to be so much fun." But men pay for this in the privacy of the hotel on their private browsers at home because it's easy and anonymous, and they don't have to think about the women. Almost all the men say, "I never thought about it.
Right.
I never considered
Yeah,
her."
I think that's one of the problems in our society.
Yeah,
is
that's why the
many
education-
men don't
Yeah.
consider women
No.
as
Yeah.
fully equal humans.
Yeah, and a lot of men never get there at any point in their lives or with their romantic partners. And that's why I think that this talking about sexual exploitation and trafficking in schools is so important because it just puts that seed in your mind that makes you question the interaction. Because if you can humanize someone, then you can't do that to them. Yeah.
So where does the health part, sex can transmit disease?
Mm-hmm.
Does that enter into this at all?
Yeah, that's also a part of the education that we provide for sex buyers, is the risks involved, the physical risks.
Women?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean,
Women and men.
yeah, it's a risk. It's risky, right? And men, yeah, I don't know what to say about that.
I mean, I'm sure.
That's a reality. Yeah. Yeah, but that's also a good way to scare men from not doing this.
Yeah.
It's like parts of your body might fall off, like in an extreme case.
Dangerous to your body parts.
Yeah. We do these these pre-tests and post-tests during the classes where it's like you're coming in with what information, what are you thinking about this, and then afterwards what are your reasons that you're not going to purchase again? Are you going to purchase again? And it's maybe 30 to 50% of them say, those photos I saw in the class are enough, So for some of them, it is humanizing the women. It is the backstory. These are riveting presentations that are given by police officers about their experiences with talking to victims. And once you learn the background, there's no way that you can justify this, even if you're the most pro sex worker. I think once you find the reality of the situation, which I would love to bundle up these classes for average people and classrooms and stuff, but we'll see how that happens over time.
That whole parts of your body might fall off argument seems to me to be pretty strong when you think about the STDs and everything else that must be, these
Yeah.
guys must.
I mean, people aren't asking to see the results of tests, right? People aren't, yeah. And that's also one of the reasons why people say, oh, we should make it legal, or we should have rules around this. So then you do have tests, you do have documentation on men and whether they've had an STD test too, but that's a whole nother thing to discuss. You have a question?
When you started speaking, I assumed this was your full-time job. but
Oh, no.
How much time do you volunteer?
So I do these classes quarterly that are all-day classes that might go up depending on how many people are arrested for this particular crime. I used to do once a month the phone banking type of thing where we do the texts and phone calls. That's kind of fallen out of the way, but I do It's hard to say because I prepare for occasions like this. I've done the sting operations, maybe quarterly as well. So it's hard to say, but it is in my free time. I had a full-time job until recently, but then my wife offered to let me go to part-time so I could focus a little bit more on my volunteer work. I do other things as well, but it's taking up more and more of my life. The more that you know, the harder it is to look away from it. So that's been my trajectory for this whole time. It's probably been seven or so years since I got involved, and it's just been more and more.
The question I have for you is, how do you do self-care for yourself? That's got to be traumatic to be exposed to some of this at some time.
That's a good question. For some, it's different for different people, especially, well, to me, the best thing for me is actually talking to these individuals on an extended basis. So the phone calls have been really tough because you might get a couple minutes with someone and they might be really angry, or they might be, or they might think that you are a sex worker, so they're saying these nasty things to you. And that's a little bit harder to take that, but when I get one-on-one with people or in small groups, that actually fills me up because I can see the humanity, and I'm really an optimist at heart, and I think people are good by nature, and I can really see that coming out in men when they are talking about this. So that's actually been a good shift for me. I know some people would be really intimidated by that situation.
The reward comes when you feel like you're helping someone.
And I should have said this earlier, but the modern movement is directed by survivors of the sex trade. And there's a mention of the Sex Trade Survivors Caucus on here. That's a pretty new organization, but as any good grassroots movement gets off the ground, it should be led by the people that are the most affected by the situation. It's traditionally been women, who care about women's rights. Men have been historically quite absent from this conversation in this work. And so that's why it's been a breath of fresh air into the movement to see men like myself and the EPIC project be so involved in this. Yeah, so they've received a lot of praise for the work that they're doing because they're getting men involved, because we think that this is intrinsically a men's issue. Of course, it's affecting women the most, but it's men that are causing the problem. So it's men that are creating the demand. It's men that are providing the solution. So it's important to take the lead of survivors to say, what do people in the life need? What do they need to exit? What are the stories? We're not in a place to be telling these awful stories about people living in the life. There's books that I've outlined here, and podcasts and stuff, and the more education that you provide for yourself, the more that you'll see that people are willing to come out and say, I am a survivor. This happened to me. These are the realities. And that's what's changing politicians and the way that police do their work, is because people are willing to talk about it, and they're getting support, and they're not being shamed. It becomes visible. Yes. We're getting a real education about what it's like. Yeah, it's moving the conversation forward.
So your nonprofit that you're starting is
Yeah.
going to be focused on men and young men mostly?
I think it'll be, it's really tough for me because I want to be shoring up young women that are transitioning into adulthood, so they're not left behind by our society, so that they have a support network. So I would ultimately like to work with young women, getting them more resilient, connected to services and employment. But given the nature of the work, more men are drawn into this. But I would like to address it from both sides of the equation, because my primary audience is, for example, kids in the foster care system, which are the most vulnerable to being trafficked. And I'm working with like alternative high schools that have young people living in poverty primarily, and have these risk factors for being trafficked. So, young men are being trafficked too on the street. So I'm trying to work with the people that need the most support, the most mentorship, the most community, and literally providing them with job opportunities so that they can both be in a culture of like healthy community, healthy masculinity, healthy femininity with other women that are working in the industry too. So it's a little bit vague, but.
And then my other question is, have you worked with Shared Hope International? Because I've been donating to them for the last probably 3 years.
I am familiar with them a little bit, but I can't really speak
It
to
sounds like
their
they're
work.
more into the children that are being trafficked, and but I think
Yeah, and I think
they do more, but
they do a lot of stuff. They're
Yeah.
really successful. And I think we talked about,
Yeah, I think I had, years ago, I think I had them here.
Yeah.
To talk to the youth.
yeah,
About how you prevent your friends from being trafficked, which
Yeah.
Epic does.
an Epic project, yeah. Another wing of what they do is my Friends Are Not For Sale, which is a youth-run organization that works in high schools. They have these clubs about trafficking awareness. Yeah, so a lot of it is about young people education. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do. So Shared Hope and Epic are doing that, and I hope to do more of that in the future too.
And I'm so glad we have these Save the Children, and as we're saving the children, we're saving the adults from
Yeah.
getting into a bad situation.
Yeah, and it's
And it was
surprising.
maddening for me to be going to workshops down at Concordia and seeing we needed those. And when I would talk to my pastor, he just ignored me, but he did listen to
Yeah,
Mike, and he listened to Beth Bentley.
Yeah.
And pretty soon we were putting in all of these.
and also what
notes.
gives me hope for the future is like that so much can change in a generation. Like young people are pretty darn smart, and they're learning from our mistakes, or they're actually listening to what we're telling them. So if we provide them an education about this early on, then that'll lead to huge changes in the culture. So that gives me hope.
I'm going to break here and just say thank Nick for coming today. It's been very informative, I really appreciate it. And you'll be around for a few minutes if you have other
Yeah,
questions.
I can
I'm
hang
sure-
out.
I think you all got the handout, but take one and there's a few extra.
Yeah, feel free to reach out with more questions or anything.
How did you get started doing this?
I just kept showing up to stuff. I guess I kind of cut myself off, but I went to this forum at a church, and Epic Project was speaking, and they said, we want men to be involved.
Okay.
So I just started showing up and showing up and showing up.
What is that, the last 10 years?
Yeah, that was 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm just curious, what started?
Yeah. yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, it was nice meeting you.
Thank you for your questions and listening to me.